Well, over the past few months, we've published a series of white papers looking at some of the key issues that arise for organisations operating in this increasingly important part of the world, and the influence and effects of the AUKUS trilateral alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US. You can find those white papers on our website at www.austability.com/white papers. Well, today it's my honour to introduce one of those authors, Robert R.J. Jennings, a close friend and colleague, the Senior Vice President of Global Operations here at Austability. He has more than 16 years of expertise in supply chain management and global operations, handling multi-million-dollar contracts and delivering solutions in complex, high-pressure environments. His white paper is titled Adaptability in the Face of Delivery Constraints, and I'm looking forward to working with him to unpack some of it. Welcome, RJ.
Well, thank you so much for having me, JT, and for the warm welcome as well.
You're welcome. Well, just before we get going, I have a quick couple of housekeeping notes to go through. So it is a Q&A, so please send through any questions you may have by clicking on the Q&A button on the screen below. And we have a team working behind the scenes. We're very grateful from Ambition PR who will collate them as we go, and then we'll get to them in the second half of today's discussion. So before we unpack your white paper, RJ, and the valuable insights and frontline experience that you've got, I'd like to just inform our viewers and listeners, get them to know you a little more. So I'm curious to know, what is something that no one else knows about you that you can share with us today on this call?
Absolutely, that's appropriate. You're making me think out of the chute. I would say, funny fact, early on, I wanted to be an astronaut. And I convinced my parents somehow to send me to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama twice. And the last time that I went, I may have been driving and been in high school getting ready to graduate. I won't say that I was a nerd, but I was highly academic. Yeah, and good times. I really, really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Well, something I didn't know. I wonder how many other people on the call knew that. Well, if we start to move into the topic of today's conversation, I'm also curious to understand what drew you to working in international supply and logistics in the defense and national security sector.
Excellent question. Honestly, I fell into government contracting. I majored in accounting in college, and I was a buyer with KBR, you know, straight out of college, 2007. Logistics has always kind of come naturally for me. I love a challenge, and a mentor once told me that if I wanted to create a name for myself and truly build my career, find a problem and fix it. So in 2012, in Kandahar, Afghanistan, I was presented with that opportunity. Afghanistan's commercial vehicle licensing requirements somehow changed in an instant, and all truck movements came to a screeching halt. So this also affected DLA's subsistence delivery. They held that contract. So what it meant for me and the rest of the DynCorp team was we had 44 sites with no food support for a couple of weeks. So we were cross-leveling food on civilian helicopters, military convoys. Pretty much if you were going that way and can carry a box, we would give it to you. Truly, the issue wasn't ours. We didn't have privity of contract, but we took it, very personal that the warfighter potentially would not have a hot meal. So we did what we could internally, and we were actually successful. And the outcome was, DynCorp, which is a commercial, prime contractor. We had a seat on the panel for the weekly sustainment brigade meetings, which historically, was all military. And I think even today, a decade later, this remains one of the most pivotal moments of my career. And it truly was a defining moment. If you were to ask me, why have I stayed? I think early on, I wasn't sure if I would do well in the military. I now know that not to be true, but this was my way of serving and giving back and creating my own impact on the world. And it's truly been fulfilling.
So very much values driven, which is the RJ I think most of us know. Very, very interesting. Well, I guess for context, since you've written since you wrote your white paper that was published earlier this year, we've seen huge geopolitical changes, with the introduction of tariffs, particularly impacting countries in the Indo-Pacific, as we all know. We've seen, the cost of living increases, the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. What impact do you see this as having on operators in the Indo-Pacific region in particular? And does it change anything that you wrote in your white paper? If you had your chance again, would there be anything in addition or anything that you would change?
Since publishing, I think the operating environment in the Indo-Pacific has grown even more complex. You mentioned the tariffs. That's not just between US and China. It's also affecting many partner nations across the region. Global inflation, so cost of logistics, materials, and labor. And I think all of this is compounded with, global conflict, which absorbs and exhausts global capacity, and it creates competition and scarcity of key resources. So I wouldn't really change anything. I think as operators providing services in the region, things are very clear. Everything is going to be harder. It's going to be more expensive and less predictable. I think the white paper's recommendations remain relevant. However, the level of urgency has escalated. It's no longer enough to be flexible. I think you have to be structurally resilient, networked, proactive, and extremely read in. I would invite everyone to go back and revisit timelines, your sourcing strategies and compliance expectations in light of the new global constraints.
Thanks, Ajay. And I guess given your global experience, I mean, you referenced Afghanistan earlier. What are the unique characteristics about operating in this region, as opposed to, say, Afghanistan, Middle East, or indeed the Euro-Atlantic, where I'm based right now?
Yeah, I'm going to say Indo-PACOM. It's a beast of its own. It's nothing like Africa, Middle East, or the Euro-Atlantic. I think the geography is more vast and it's segmented, lots of islands. So supply lines stretch across the oceans and connect islands. And with those islands comes very limited infrastructure. And the unique thing or the interesting thing is the regulatory environment tends to be very layered. Especially within countries that are trying to balance, the US and Chinese influence. So places like Afghanistan or Africa, I saw the challenges being largely physical or bureaucratic. But in Indo-Pacific, there's also a geopolitical sensitivity, and I won't go too far down the political road. But a procurement decision can be seen as a signal of strategic alignment. So I think local governments are very cautious. Alliances are very nuanced. And we, as service providers in the region, we have to navigate not only the politics, but the logistical terrain as well as the cultures.
So it seems in some ways much more complex than some other parts of the world, given all those layers and sort of additional inputs that need to be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. I mean, I arrived at Afghanistan and Iraq much later in the conflict, and I think a lot of the hard work was already done. But having an opportunity to not be boots on ground, but arrive a little earlier, to say it's more complex would be an understatement.
You say that working in the Indo-Pacific, is challenging, and there are those delivery constraints, logistical hurdles, and resistant industrial landscapes. I mean, those were some of the lines that you've used in your white paper. And you talk about a new approach being needed to overcome these obstacles with suppliers and operational support providers. And you reference three key areas, so technology, partnerships, and teams. I guess now looking into that and starting to unpack some of those issues in those three key areas, thought if we start off with the technology piece, how can technology adoption help with Indo-Pacific operations? I mean, is it just, are we just talking about drones? Are we just talking about communication systems? I mean, how can it help? How is it part of the solution?
So I think the harsh geography and limited infrastructure, it demands smarter tools. And I think that these are defining constraints for the region. The unique thing here is you can't always, send more people or develop that infrastructure. I think instead the path forward depends on, really tapping into technology. And let me also mention this. I think that any company that's not embracing technology is going to find themselves um, kind of left behind. And that right technology stack or a complement, it truly has to be tailored to the operating environment in which you're operating. So you touched on a number of things, but satellite-based asset tracking is an example of how technology is helping us as operators, maintain that control and visibility in those remote environments. So we see improved accuracy, reliability, and timing. And this allows our folks on ground to better predict delivery windows and proactively manage risk, which we in this industry are constantly trying to do. I think that there's another area of opportunity on the ERP side, so enterprise resource planning, really critical advantages. The real-time control over procurement, inventory, and dispatch operations. You're minimizing waste. You're doing more with less. So you can either better utilize your manning on ground or deploy with less personnel. And also, it ensures that your field teams always have access to what they need when they need it so that they can make those real-time decisions. There's emerging technologies like 3D printing, that are showing promise. Ironically, we use this in Poland for other reasons. There, it was because a lot of the assets that we were maintaining were so ancient that replacement spares weren't readily available. So a much different reason, but still effective nonetheless. I think when you manufacture components locally, you drastically reduce reliance on long and vulnerable supply chains. And I think within Indo-PACOM, shipping times are measured more so in weeks and days. So it's going to be imperative that you really tap in and realize these efficiencies. On the drones and autonomous vehicles front, another key area, lots of inaccessible terrain, mountainous islands, remote jungles, and really just areas without secure ground corridors. These platforms can safely extend operational reach and allow the service provider to deliver critical supplies without risking human teams. So specifically in the Philippines, as you go down south near Zamboanga, there are extremist groups that occupy that territory. And I know a number of contractors who have personnel on site now, and security is in full effect, is what I'll say. So this is real life. I think it's relevant today. And it's definitely an opportunity. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that none of this technology works in a vacuum. It does require trained personnel and a deep understanding of local conditions. You have to do your homework. For Austability, we are supporting Typhoon Marawa, and we started in 2023. I think that we can all agree that all of the technology in the world really wouldn't have helped, the immense disruptions that we saw in the supply chain. Technology alone would not have gotten us there. But knowing the lay of the land and being able to identify bottlenecks and, different sourcing opportunities in the region, it's proved invaluable to us. And I think it was very instrumental in our success there.
And are these sort of technological innovations that you're talking about, are these sorts of things nice to haves, or are they must haves?
I think they are must haves. And let me also say that it doesn't have to be a grand gesture, right? It could be doing the easy things extremely well. So Starlink, we had operations in Niger, and we were struggling with internet capability. It was commonplace, that once everyone was off work, you could not get in contact with anyone on site. So we bought Starlink, which is a great product. And I think in the end, our internet capability exceeded the customers. So again, it can be the smallest thing that can greatly impact your operations. And from a safety standpoint, being able to reach out and touch our personnel there, it's a must.
And as you travel the region, travel the world, we're going to visit different sites, different clients, different suppliers. Have you come across any sort of unique innovations that that you haven't seen before? Is there anything in particular that sort of occurs to you that's on the horizon that you know that could actually be a game changer?
Going back to the 3D printing, I think it's underestimated and a bit underutilized at the moment. But go to Dubai, they're actually 3D printing buildings, and this could really change the way that we provide, contingency life support services abroad. I think there's an immense capability, and the more that it develops, the more it will be widely adopted. So truly an opportunity there.
Yeah. And I guess like anything, there's sort of the twin sides. There's the benefits that it brings, but also the risk that it brings when some of these things get into the wrong hands. But yeah, very, very interesting, and I understand completely the importance of staying ahead of technology. And I guess, it's just happening so quickly. If we start to have a look at, you talk about teams and culture. So navigating local culture and different ways of working, is one of those layers to be navigating. We know governments prioritize local businesses when they're contracting. To what extent do we see the same occurring in the Indo-Pacific region? It's quite disparate. Are we seeing that same sort of desire, prioritization on local business?
Absolutely. I can think of tenders right now within the Philippines, Korea, and Japan, that mandate that you have to be a local business. So yes, these governments are prioritizing local business, definitely in their procurement strategies, and I think it's being done both formally through policy, as I just mentioned, but also informally through longstanding relationships. I think that there's an expectation that foreign contractors are to partner with or subcontract to domestic firms, and rightly so. These folks, they want to stimulate their local economies, but also build like a sovereign capability, and naturally reduce dependency on all of the external actors. I think that there is a culture to try to keep as much at home as possible.
Given that awareness of local business and culture is vital, I guess, is vital to successfully operating in the Indo-Pacific. What are the challenges and opportunities that presents businesses like Austability and the businesses of representatives who are here on the call today?
Yeah. So, especially for entities like us, yes, there are definitely challenges and opportunities. I think on the challenge side, the local entities operate with more informal structure, and their standard business practices greatly differ from the Western standard. In some countries, procurement decisions are influenced by personal relationships. I can tell you when we first entered Japan, I found out quickly in approving expense reports that it is the customer who actually courts the supplier. So there's an expectation to take them to dinner and, have drinks and establish that personal relationship. And keeping in line with that, you also see that based on these personal relationships, people will execute multi-million-dollar contracts with no formal contract in place. So very, very interesting. And having been to Philippines and been on ground to source there locally, you will find a lot of folks who represent or operate within the local ecosystem actually conduct business through their personal social media channels. So not even a business account, but literally their personal social media accounts. So very nuanced. But I think because there is a reluctance to adopt the Western standard, it creates some QA issues for us, especially on the compliance and reporting side. Yeah, and it can make doing business in these regions very difficult.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting. How do you reconcile that from an organizational perspective? If you're sort of using personal accounts, things are quite informal. I guess, yeah. How is that reconciled? How can you make it work? Because presumably it's very difficult. Well, you can't impose the way you want to do things necessarily.
No, no, and I think we used it to make initial contact. Eventually, it did transition to a more formal platform, but yeah, it's difficult, and I think as people who are moving into their market, we have to adapt. But what we can't do is compromise, the compliance requirements that we have. So it's all about that happy medium. And I think Indo-Pacific is especially unique and difficult to navigate. And I bring this up because I can recall it would probably take more than one hand to count the number of instances where we were engaged by an entity who lacked the reach and infrastructure within Indo-PACOM, and they were willing to bring us into the fold just because we had a presence and had folks on ground. So it's so vital, and I think here's what I'm really trying to say: Indo-PACOM, you have to have boots on ground in order to navigate. This is not a region that you can successfully navigate, online via market research. You have to mobilize, you have to shake hands, you have to court and establish those personal relationships. Without them, you're 100% dead in water.
Well, that sort of kind of brings me back to what you said earlier on in this particular section is that importance of those relationships. How I guess sort of from the beginning, you're coming into a location where you may not have been before. How do you start to develop those relationships that can be so key in sort of operational business outcomes, winning these contracts? And what you do in one part of the region, presumably, is not necessarily. I mean, can you apply the same kind of techniques or ways of operating in a different part of the Indo-Pacific? So I guess two in one question. One is, what is it? How do you develop those relationships so that they're deep, trusting, where you can start to talk about those multi-million-dollar contracts? And then is it the same as what you would do in other parts of the region? Do you have to then adapt if you're working in a different part? Because we're talking about a huge part of the world, geographically speaking.
Yeah, I think there are going to be minor nuances based on the region, but I think, overall, step one and where we, Austability, found tremendous success, was mobilizing, getting someone on the ground and aligning ourselves with someone who could help us navigate that market. So bringing someone locally who's respected, that's resourced, networked, bringing them into the Austability team, and leveraging their relationships to get us indoors. And it's proven invaluable. Guam comes to mind there, but we equally had to do the same thing within Japan. Yes, we have someone who is Western and native speaking, but we also found that the local industry, they respond a lot better to the local national that we hired. So he's more customer facing. I think you have to figure it out, tap into, do your research, and then tailor your needs. But across the board, step one is finding that intermediary, I would say, to bridge the gap.
And do you see that sort of essentially happening across that's essentially a good way of going about business across the region, whether it's Japan, Korea, Guam, Tinian, Indonesia, wherever it happens to be, Philippines. That's a sort of a must-have, is it?
It's been step one for us in Indo-PACOM specifically. And I can tell you that, we currently have operations in Guam, Tinian, South Korea, Japan, and I apologize if I'm missing any. But you will find someone local embedded in every single one of those operations. It's imperative.
And then having talk about partnerships here. So presumably there's well, how important is it to be having those relationships with local governments, local councils, local business leaders? How important are they in that whole ecosystem of being able to in terms of being able to develop those trusted relationships and being seen as a trusted partner in that particular location?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very important. And I think this is a universal point, that making those alliances and building those relationships, especially within government, it pays in dividends. When you run into regulatory issues, they can help you navigate it. We did the same in Niger, a completely different market, but it served us. Some of the SAL requirements didn't comply with local labor law, so we kind of had to get everyone around a table and hash it out. But having those relationships and having trusted partners who could guide us, completely invaluable.
Thank you. Thanks, RJ. Just before we get into the third part, the third focus area that you've raised in your white paper, which is around the importance of teams, I just wanted to remind our viewers that if you have any questions, we're very keen to get to all of you. Please just write down your question or comment in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to them shortly. So the Q&A box, very keen to hear comments and questions from you. RJ, just now returning to your white paper as we continue to unpack it. So looking at the importance of building diverse and capable teams. So the Indo-Pacific region, as we know, has a huge range of cultures, religions, different ethnic groups. It's a multiplicity of complexity and texture. How can this benefit or hinder operations?
Absolutely. So cultural sensitivity, in this instance, it's not optional. I think it's an operational imperative. Indo-Pacific is one of the most culturally and religiously diverse regions in the world, as you mentioned. And I think it presents both its benefits and challenges. And I think how it plays out really depends on how an organization prepares. So on the one hand, a multicultural environment, it does encourage more adaptive and inclusive teams. Those that understand the local customs, the language, you see decision-making dynamics are a lot more effective, and you're able to really gain trust, reduce friction, and ultimately deliver on ground, which is what we all are striving to do. I think on the other hand, failure to account for the cultural nuances, whether it's a religious observance, a communication style, community hierarchy, etc., it can really lead to misunderstandings, delays, or even the loss of local support. And I think the loss of local support is a big one, because you're already an outsider coming into a new market. And I think that once you are out, it's going to be very difficult to get back in. Bad news travels fast, and these communities within Indo-PACOM are very close knit, and incestuous in some regards. So I think that's why we at Austability, we prioritize the development of diverse and culturally fluent teams. And it's not a compliance checkbox, but it's a critical enabler of mission success. You have to embed cultural awareness into your recruitment, your training, and daily engagement. It's a part of everything that you do day in, day out. I think it helps avoid missteps and allows our teams to operate with respect and effectiveness in very local context. So to sum it up, it's an imperative.
Imperative. I mean, I have seen in different parts of the world where people sort of fly in a workforce, and yes, I've always wondered about the wisdom of flying in a workforce from wherever, and just what the impact that has on the building of goodwill and a long-term sustainable kind of partnership.
I'm sorry, my phone went off. Can you repeat for me, sir? I'm
It's
muting.
just
I do apologize.
I've seen when people have flown in workforces
Yes, sir.
into locations to do work, and often wondered the wisdom of that. I guess there is that you're bringing in a whole lot of corporate knowledge, so a knowledge of how we go about doing our business. But I've often wondered about the sustainability and of that over the long term in terms of sort of really having an impact on a positive impact on a local community and developing those long-term relationships. Because I guess that's part of what it is, isn't it? It's we talk about at Austability sort of fostering peace and security, and part of that is actually having a benefit on a local community, and presumably this is one way that you can do that.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad that you raised this point, because as I was preparing for this webinar, it came to mind how nuanced the Indo-Pacific is. Within Iraq and Afghanistan, I think because of what was going on in the nature of business, the business model was to mobilize lots of expats, and even to bring in some support folks from Eastern Europe as well, right? Because you want to be competitive in your labor approach. And yes, there was an emphasis on hiring some of the locals, more related to translation and some of the services. But here, it's a lot different. In order to navigate this market and based on what's going on and how things are exploding, again, you have to bring in those local resources. And again, it's completely different. And as we look back to Iraq and Afghanistan, that was a conflict environment. This is probably more operational posturing and strategic in nature. But yeah, you have to. And we at Austability, we tend to reach back to the West and pull key people. But even we have had to take a hard look at, how we are staffing within Indo-PACOM and really what serves us best.
Thanks, RJ. Before we get to questions, and they're starting to come through, so thank you. Just in the chat below, and questions very welcome. I just have another question. We hear a lot about supply chain risk, particularly when we're dealing with such, although it's not an area, it's not a conflict zone as such. It is a contested part of the world. I think we agree that that's sort of the situation we're in at the moment. There's lots of ocean and lots of distance to cover. How then do you build resilience? Is it all about diverse and capable teams in terms of developing that resilience, or is there more to it?
So there is definitely more to it. Yes, the people are very critical, but I think you also have to do your research. And Indo-Pacific, as I mentioned previously, this is not a region that you can just kind of step into and expect to make sense of immediately. It requires in-depth research and knowledge and really developing the concept of support that accounts for the region's logistical realities. This is a maritime domain. And as you mentioned, it's defined by island chains and long distances, of course, with limited infrastructure. So I think these conditions amplify traditional supply chain risk. So you're looking at longer transit times, fewer options for rerouting, and greater vulnerability to weather and political shifts. So here, building your supplier ecosystem and knowing what countries you can tap into for what commodities will serve you immensely well. A
Great.
single point of failure in Indo-Pacific is not an option. It's not an option anywhere, but here it can be even more critical.
Even more critical. Yeah. Thanks, RJ. Well, we have a question that's come through from Christopher Warren. How do you maintain good governance and compliance with local partners in such a vast region with multiple nations and cultures, particularly as the environment becomes complex? So good governance and compliance with local partners.
Yes. So, yeah, this is a tough one. I think that anytime you enter into a new AO, you have to surround yourself with subject matter experts. So, on the regulatory and compliance side, that could be attorneys, other consultants to help you navigate. But I think what I'm saying is you have to bring in that subject matter expertise. And also something that's very unique about operating here, from the prime world, it's highly regulated. The FAR is not an easy read. The flow downs are immense. And sometimes in these more remote areas, you're dealing with smaller entities or mom and pops. So I think, companies that do what we do, we have to bridge that gap. And somehow be mindful of what's important from a compliance standpoint, but also kind of filter out the white noise. So there's not an easy answer. You have to get read in. You need great leadership and advisors around you. And there is an additional point. On the governance and compliance side, you're also going to want to mentor your local partners, right? So stands to reason that they probably haven't done business on this scale and to Western standard. So through you developing them, seeing, a capacity and capability, and then bringing them up, again, you're greatly increasing your resilience and your ability to perform. And I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. No, very, very comprehensive. Second question from Graham Gilkinson. In the Indo-Pacific, how do you see fuel security, petrol security over the vast area if supplies are blocked or cut off? And I guess Senior Vice President of Strategy Relationships, Gilbert Kearns he would probably have some insight here given his background in fuel. But what are your views around fuel security if supplies are cut off? What are the issues there, and what are some of the solutions that we should be looking at?
Fuel. Yeah, this is a tough one. Everyone needs it. When supplies are cut off, it puts you in a bad state. I think that especially in Indo-PACOM, again, having multiple vendors, pre-positioning key resources so that you can operate. It's all about, forward planning, and not being so under the gun should something not go to plan. And especially, the more remote you get, the more likely you are to run into these logistical hurdles. But fuel by itself is a big one. And I think it's really all about forward planning and pre-positioning.
Yeah, and I think it's if you don't have fuel, you don't have energy. It's it's critical, and in Australia, it's been an issue for some time.
And to that point, if I can expand just a little bit, and that's why when you're building your CONOP and you're identifying and managing those risks. These are the areas that you really want to highlight and really work backwards. And even if that means, doing things that you necessarily wouldn't be paid for, just so that you're better positioned to perform against your competitors. I just think that you have to be smart.
Thanks, RJ. Question from Amadou Niger. Um, Question is, what does future readiness look like for a company providing base operational support in a fast-changing geopolitical landscape, like the Indo-Pacific? What does future readiness look like?
I think future readiness, you have to do your homework. I think it's truly anticipating the needs of your customer, and being able to read the room when no one else is looking. So for instance, Tinian, they're building a runway, right? And that runway obviously is the start of something huge and immense. So what does that mean for Tinian? What types of services will they need down the road? What does the local labor um, look like? What can they provide? What would you have to bring in externally? I think in order to be mission ready and able to compete, you have to be able to look forward and be forward planning when no one else is even venturing into that area of the world, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Another question based on our Austability's experience in remote and logistically challenging environments like Niger. How is Austability adapting its operational playbook to suit the Indo-Pacific under the AUKUS framework? So, what is it that we're doing? What are the learnings, I guess, from places like Niger? How are we adapting that experience into quite a interesting space? You talk about the layers from
Mm-hmm.
from early on. What are we doing to make sure that we're adapting our operational playbook locally?
So I would say, in short, we are doing our homework. We are understanding the customer, their needs. We're anticipating them, but also drawing on lessons learned. I mentioned the IT piece. Now we own several of those units. We can deploy with them. We stubbed our toe, just in full transparency, in a few areas in Indo-Pacom, and I think one of those areas in full transparency was really in aligning ourselves with the right strategic partners. I think when you hit the ground, there's this immense push to stand up operations, and it's really difficult to take a breath, and thoroughly evaluate, what are you doing 30, 60, 90, and what does your vendor ecosystem look like? So again, that forward planning and kind of being able to read the room and anticipate these needs. We're on ground sometimes before the customer is there, and we're already establishing those relationships and networks so that when things kick off, we're better postured and better for having already been there on ground as well.
Thanks, RJ. Are there when we look at the region, given its spread, are there any particular parts of Indo-Pacom where operations are noticeably harder due to geography or local culture? And what tactics would you recommend in using in some of these more sort of challenging parts of the region?
I think one that comes to mind for Austability, it's Tinian. They have a population of less than 1,000 people. It's remote. You have to take a a very small five-seater plane to even get there. And logistically, there's a set operating schedule, and if you miss that, you're kind of out. So I think the geographies of the Indo-Pacific are not created equal. You really have to look at where you're going, and develop those workarounds. As you get more remote, there's minimal housing, labor shortages. Um, so again, anticipating the needs of the customer and forward planning, pre-positioning assets, and making sure that you are ready to perform while aligning yourself with the local with your local partners, and embedding yourself in that culture and not just being a service provider on ground, but also being a contributor, someone who's there not only to, deliver a service and make money, but also, to make a difference and leave it better than we found it. And that's a core, philosophy of Austability as well.
Well, I'm conscious we've got about 10 minutes to go, but just sort of picking up on that particular example, or that particular reference, can you provide some examples of what good local community integration looks like, where it's worked really well, and talk about the real life tangible benefits that's then resulted in?
Absolutely. So Guam comes to mind. There, we've hosted industry days to interact with the local community. We have sponsored, youth athletic teams. We continue to, in our sourcing practices, to go island first and really tap in to see what we can do there. I think it's important to be viewed as a part of the community and to reshape, kind of the perception that you're a foreigner that's come in, a smash and grab job to do something and then you're going to leave. I think by embedding yourself in the community, giving back, and here's another important point. When you have success, I think, or when an entity has success, a prime, subcontractor, et cetera, it's really important to celebrate those victories very publicly, with the support elements that contributed. So for us, it's going to be our supplier ecosystem. Maybe that's an awards banquet or, some type of recognition on base from the customer, but you want to include them in all of those victories. And I think that when you form that relationship and truly that partnership is when you see, your operating capacity and capability truly grow on island.
Fantastic. Well, if we just go back to the partnerships piece, can I ask you, when faced with sort of differing local standards, is there a limit to which operators should flex their required standards? Is there a base level of standards that we should always be aiming for?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the easy answer to this is compliance is a non-negotiable, especially in government contracting. I think operating flexibility doesn't always mean compromising your standards, but there will be some level of adaptation or adaptability that is required, but only within clear limits. Of course, you can adjust how you communicate, how you report, and even, those phase compliance milestones. But what you should never flex, or else you'll find yourself in very, very hot water. Anything relating to safety, legal integrity, or ethical accountability. I was at a conference recently, and someone stood up and said, "You can be a small business and you can be compliant, but you can't be a small business that is compliant." And you go, there's some nuggets in that. However, the reality is, for longevity in the industry, you have to be compliant. Not being so can get you debarred. Yeah,
absolutely. It is a good reminder that there are some not non-negotiables for some very good reasons. If we look at that first, the first element, so technology and the importance of technology, and not being a nice to have, but sort of a must have, being, in ensuring that things are sustainable, durable, and effective, and that you can deliver. Can you talk through an example of where Austability, where we've used new technology to significantly improve on-site operations?
The first thing that comes to mind is Guam, and we're doing a construction project there, the Typhoon Marawa. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Reconstruction effort. And with construction, highly regulated, there's a big quality aspect there, but something that we did so that we could better operate was we equipped all of our quality professionals with tablets that were on Wi-Fi. So as they're doing their inspections, we're getting real time data that can be actioned, and not only that, but reported up, in accordance with the contract. So I think it can be the smallest thing, and sometimes it's doing the easy things, really, really well that leads to success. But just implementing that, it significantly changed our operations. When you are inspecting and auditing so much, there is a manual element to going back to the office and uploading all of that and putting it in the right format. But if you're somehow able to do that, on site in the moment via tablet, and with Wi-Fi, send off your reports. Then when you get back, you're able to focus on more high level things, which ultimately is, operating within standard, and giving the absolute best service to our customer.
Thanks, RJ. That certainly is a huge amount of work going on in that part of the world at the moment. We're sadly out of time, but I thank you so much to all of you who have joined us today and who have sent through questions. Thank you very much, RJ, for being able to be so open and honest and sharing your insights and knowledge, for spending time writing that white paper. I hope it's been an informative session for all of those of you who have participated today. As a reminder, this is the first of a series of AUKUS Unpacked online events that we'll be running. So if you enjoyed today, please keep an eye out on our LinkedIn page for the next session, which will be with retired Australian Brigadier Mark Smethurst, who wrote the first white paper that we published earlier this year in this particular series. If you would like a free copy of any of the papers, I encourage you to go to www.austability.com/whitepapers. And finally, thanks to all those who made today possible. Our white paper authors, including RJ, researchers, graphic designers, and the team at Ambition PR. And thank you, RJ, for being so generous again with your time and expertise, and to you, our viewers, for being part of today's webinar. At Austability, we have 13 worldwide offices, strong presence in the Indo-Pacific. So if there's anything that you'd like to know more about or need support in your own mission, please don't hesitate to get in touch by emailing info@austability.com or me at john.thompson with a P at austability.com. I hope you have a lovely rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever in the world you are. So from me for now, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.